If you turn on the news or scroll through social media, you could be forgiven for thinking that human sexuality is the most contested territory on earth, and that everyone arguing about it is armed with certainty and nothing else. So let's do something radical. Let's put the noise aside and ask what the actual peer review science says. Not opinions, not politics, but science. For most of the 20th century, Western science and society operated on a beautifully simple model of human sex and sexuality. It had three assumptions baked into it. First, there are exactly two biological sexes, male and female, and everyone belongs cleanly to one of them. Second, your gender identity, your internal sense of being a man or a woman, matches your biological sex automatically, the way the label on a jar matches its contents. And third, people are sexually attracted to the other sex. Men desire women, women desire men. Symmetrical, the kind of model an engineer would design. And here is the important thing to say up front, because honesty requires it. This model does describe the majority of people. In the most recent Gallup polling of over 13,000 American adults conducted in 2025, 86% identified as heterosexual. So the scientific question is not, is the classic model wrong for everyone? It clearly isn't. The question is, how large is the population that doesn't fit? What does that population actually look like? And does its existence tell us that the model is incomplete? Nature, as usual, turns out to be less interested in our filing systems than we are. Over the last 70 years, researchers in biology, psychology, and epidemiology have chipped away at each of the three assumptions. Let's take them one at a time. Start with biology because surely you'd think chromosomes at least behave themselves. Sex development involves chromosomes, gonads, hormones, hormone receptors, and anatomy. And these usually align, but not always. The most cited estimate of how often they don't comes from a review by Melanie Blackless and Fausto Sterling and colleagues published in the American Journal of Human Biology in 2000. Reviewing the medical literature, they estimated that as many as 1.7% of live births show some divergence from the textbook male or female pathway. That figure includes conditions like Klinefelter syndrome, XXY chromosomes, roughly 1 in 1,000 male births, congenital adrenal hyperplasia, and androgen insensitivity syndrome, in which a person with XY chromosomes develops a female body because their cells simply decline to answer testosterone's phone calls. That 1.7% has been contested, and the dispute is instructive. Physician Leonard Sachs, writing in the Journal of Sex Research in 2002, argued that if you restrict ambiguous gender to cases where chromosomal sex is inconsistent with anatomy or where anatomy is genuinely obscure, the true figure collapses to about 0.018%, 1 in 5 or 6,000. Clinically, genital ambiguity noticeable at birth occurs in roughly 1 in 2,000 to 1 in 4,500 births. So depending on your definition, intersex variation is either rare or fairly common, but either way, it exists. And even the conservative estimate implies tens of thousands of Americans. The conclusion most biologists draw is not that sex is meaningless, it obviously isn't, but that sex is bimodal rather than strictly binary. Two large clusters with real human beings in between. In 2019 review by Janet Shibley, Hyde and colleagues in American Psychologist surveyed this evidence, including neuroscience, showing that most human brains are mosaics of features rather than cleanly male brain or female brain, and concluded that a strict binary is scientifically unsupportable as a universal claim. Two mountains, yes, but mountains have foothills. On the second assumption, the attraction runs exclusively towards the other sex. The first large-scale challenge came from Alfred Kinsey at Indiana University, whose reports in 1948 and 1953 landed on American breakfast tables with roughly the effect of a grenade in a punch bowl. Kinsey interviewed thousands of Americans and concluded that orientation wasn't an either-or category at all. He proposed his famous 0 to 6 scale, from exclusively heterosexual to exclusively homosexual, with many people falling somewhere in between. His sampling was flawed by modern standards. His percentages ran high. But this core insight that orientation is a spectrum with a substantial middle has held up remarkably well. What do rigorous modern surveys show? Gallup's survey 2025 data found 9% of U.S. adults identifying as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or something other than heterosexual, versus 86% heterosexual, with 5% declining to answer, presumably on the grounds that it was none of Gallup's business. That 9% was actually triple the number found by research in 2012, when it was 3.5%, driven overwhelmingly by younger generations. Around 23% of adults under 30 now identify as LGBTQ+, compared with 3% or less among those over 50. Hold that generational pattern in your mind. We'll come back to that and what it means, because it does not mean what cable news think it means. Breaking down the 9%, bisexuality is by far the most common identity at 5.3% of all U.S. adults, nearly 59% of the entire LGBTQ plus population. Gay men account for 1.6% of adults, lesbians 1.4%, transgender people roughly 1%, and about 0.5% identify as queer, pansexual, or something else. This matters because the popular image of a gay versus straight divide misses the actual statistical structure. The largest non-heterosexual group is attracted to more than one gender. The middle of Kinsey's scale. It turns out it's not a hallway, it's a ballroom. But identity is only one measure. And here is where it gets scientifically interesting. Researchers distinguish 3 dimensions. Identity, meaning what you call yourself. Behavior, meaning who you've actually been with. And attraction, meaning who you desire. These do not line up neatly, and the gaps between them are some of the most robust findings in sex research. Casey Copen and colleagues at the CDC's National Center for Health Statistics analyzed the National Survey of Family Growth in 2016 and found that while only about 1.3% of women identified as lesbian, 17.4% of women aged 18 to 44 reported having some sexual contact with another woman at some point. For men, same-sex behavior ran around 6%, several times the rate of gay identification. Attraction data show the same pattern. Substantially more people report some same-sex attraction than ever adopt a non-heterosexual label. There is even laboratory evidence on this. Meredith Chivers and colleagues in a 2004 study in psychological science measured genital arousal directly and found that women, on average, regardless of stated orientation, showed physiologically responses to a much broader range of stimuli than men, whose arousal tracked their stated orientation with almost bureaucratic precision. And Lisa Diamond of the University of Utah, in a 10-year longitudinal study of women published in 2008, documented that many women's attractions genuinely shift across the lifespan, a phenomenon she named sexual fluidity, now well established, particularly in women. So on the orientation question, roughly 9 in 10 people fit the heterosexual assumption by identity. But by behavior or attraction, the doesn't perfectly fit group is considerably larger, plausibly 15 to 20% of women by some measures. The classic model, in other words, is a decent passport photo of humanity. It is not a portrait. Third assumption, that everyone's internal sense of gender matches their natal sex. Here, the best current population estimates come from Williams Institute at UCLA School of Law, which in 2025 combined CDC survey data with statistical modeling and concluded that about 2.8 million Americans aged 13 and older identify as transgender, roughly 1% of that age group. That breaks down to 0.8% of adults and a notably higher 3.3% of teenagers. An earlier Williams Institute estimate from 2016 puts the adult figure at 0.6%. And that older number still circulates in the literature, including in the major psychiatric review we'll dissect in part 2. The honest summary is that population surveys consistently land just under 1% of adults, with the estimate drifting up slightly as measurement improves. Keep that number under 1% in your memory. In part 2, we will do some heavy lifting with that number. Now, some definitions so we are all on the same page. A transgender woman is someone assigned male at birth who identifies and lives as a woman. A transgender man was assigned female at birth and identifies as a man. A cisgender person identifies with the sex they were assigned at birth, which is most of us, and which, before roughly 1994, was simply called a person. And here's a statistic that reliably surprises audiences. Among the roughly 2.1 million transgender adults in the Williams Institute data, the split is almost perfectly even three ways. About a third are transgender women, a third transgender men, and a third non-binary. The stereotype that transgender mostly means trans woman is simply not what the data show. A peer-reviewed review by Kenneth Zucker in Sexual Health in 2017 surveyed international studies and found adult self-reported transgender identity ranging from roughly 0.5% to 1.3% across countries, consistent with the American figures. Older clinical estimates from 1990s on people who reached surgical clinics puts prevalence at 1 in 10,000 or lower. The gap illustrates how much your measuring instrument matters. Counting people who show up at the surgery is not the same as asking people how they identify themselves any more than counting Ferraris tells you how many people would like one. One crucial scientific point before we go further. Gender identity and sexual orientation are independent variables. Knowing someone is a transgender tells you precisely nothing about whom they are attracted to. The 2015 U.S. Transgender Survey, the largest survey of trans Americans, nearly 28,000 respondents, found that only about 15% of transgender respondents described themselves as straight. Around 21% said queer, 18% pansexual, 16% gay, lesbian or same-gender attracted, 14% bisexual, and 10% asexual. A transgender woman may be attracted to men, to women, to both, or to no one. Every combination exists, and every combination has been counted, which brings us to the combinations themselves, because once you accept that sex, gender identity, and orientation are separate variables, the arithmetic gets busy. On the orientation axis, heterosexual attracted to a different gender, homosexual, gay, or lesbian attracted to the same gender, bisexual attracted to more than one, pansexual attracted regardless of gender, asexual experiencing little or no sexual attraction to anyone. On the gender identity axis, cisgender, transgender men, transgender women, Non-binary, identifying as neither exclusively male nor female, or both, or fluid between them. Any orientation can combine with any identity: a cisgender heterosexual man, a cisgender bisexual woman, a transgender man attracted to men, who is therefore, and this occasionally short-circuits people at dinner parties, a gay man, a non-binary person who is asexual. All of these are real, surveyed populations, not thought experiments. Now a confusion worth clearing up explicitly, because it's extremely common: non-binary versus asexual. These get mixed up constantly, and the distinction is actually simple once you see the two axes. Non-binary answers the question, what is your gender? It says nothing whatsoever about attraction. Asexual answers the question, whom are you sexually attracted to? And the answer is essentially no one or almost no one. It says nothing about the gender. A non-binary person can have a vigorous romantic and sexual life. An asexual person can be an entirely conventional cisgender man or cisgender woman who simply experiences no sexual pull towards anyone. Confusing them is like confusing someone's nationality with their appetite. The numbers confirm their independence. On non-binary identity, a 2021 Williams Institute study estimated about 1.2 million American LGBTQ adults, 11% of the LGBTQ population, identify as non-binary, and notably, a majority of those non-binary adults are not transgender in the transition sense. The identity cuts across categories. On asexuality, the foundational study is Anthony Bogart, 2004 paper in the Journal of Sex Research, analyzing a British national probability sample of over 18,000 people, which found that about 1% of adults reported never having felt sexual attraction to anyone. That 1% has been roughly replicated since and is now the standard prevalence estimate. Interestingly, asexual people often still form deep romantic attachments. Researchers distinguish romantic orientation from sexual orientation, and some sexual people describe themselves a heteroromantic or homoromantic. And in that Williams Institute study, 14% of non-binary adults described their orientation as asexual, meaning the categories overlap for some individuals but are clearly not the same thing, since 80% of non-binary people were not asexual. Two different questions. Occasionally the same person answers both. So let's total the ledger. What proportion of the population falls outside the classic two genders heterosexual model? The most conservative answer uses self-identification, about 9% of American adults, 1 in 11, roughly 23 million people, and among Gen Z closer to 1 in 4. A broader answer uses behavior and attraction. Count everyone who has ever experienced same-sex attraction or contact, and the figure rises substantially, up to 17% of women by the CDC's behavioral data. Add intersex variation, somewhere between 0.02% and 1.7%, depending on definition. Add the roughly 1% who are transgender and the roughly 1% who are asexual, remembering these groups partially overlap. However you count, the population outside the classic model is measured in tens of millions in the United States alone, comparable in size to the entire demographic group we build medicine, policy, and marketing campaigns around. So, is the classic model valid? The scientifically careful answer has two parts. As a description of the statistical majority, yes, it works. Most people are born unambiguously male or female, identify with that sex, and are attracted to the other one. But as a universal model, the claim that this is how humans simply are, it fails on all three of its assumptions. Biological sex is bimodal, not perfectly binary. Orientation is a spectrum with a large bisexual middle and a documented fluidity, and gender identity, while matching birth sex for about 99% of people, diverges for a persistent, cross-culturally documented minority. This is why the peer-reviewed consensus reflected in that 2019 American Psychologist Review and in a major 2016 review by J. Michael Bailey's team in Psychological Science in the Public Interest has moved to a multi-dimensional model. Biological sex, gender identity, and sexual orientation are related but distinct variables, each with its own distribution, not because of politics, but because that's the model that fits the data. Science doesn't get to vote on what people are. It only gets to count. And that 1% minority whose gender identity diverges from their birth sex, they have become the most argued about 1% in the modern public life. In part 2, we take everything we've established here and go deep. What the psychiatric literature actually says about transgender people, the mental health statistics that should alarm everyone regardless of politics, what brain scans reveal, whether transitioning helps, and yes, the sports controversy, complete with sworn Senate testimony and an astrophysicist's proposal to reorganize athletics by hormone level. Bring a calculator, the numbers are not what the shouting suggests.